Welcome to Local Voices on 94.7 KPIP. I'm Rachel Steele, and with me today is Jim Steele, a local historian, journalist, CMU graduate, former history teacher, longtime Fayette resident, and a man who also happens to be my father.
Correct.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Mr. Steele.
You're welcome. All right, let's go and have at it.
Okay, so Sunday, September the 1st, 2019 marks the 80th anniversary of the official start of World War II. And that is what we're going to talk about here. What led up to the start of World War II? First, some people say World War II actually started on July the 7th, 1937, when the Marco Polo Bridge incident led to a prolonged war between China and Japan. What was the Marco Polo Bridge incident?
I'm not that familiar with the things that happened in China during that time, except that war was going on there for a goodly number of years, as China was a very weak feudal society, and Japan had visions of expansion and domination not only in China but in the Pacific. And that's all part of the equation, but it's all very complicated.
And is that kind of how China ended up on our side?
Yes, it was. It was. And this particularly after Pearl Harbor, which of course is, as we're talking now, somewhere in the distance. But the event that occurred on September 1st, 1939, which, as you noted, was 80 years ago, was the fact that Germany invaded Poland, and then a series of alliances kicked in, and that is what is normally recognized as the official start of World War II. Now, you have to also keep in mind that this is very, very complex. We're going to really kind of have the Cliff Notes version here. There are many historians and scholars, and I don't count myself among them, but that really feel that World War II was really kind of an extension of World War I with a 20-year hiatus in between. Mm-hmm. But a lot of things that happened during and after World War I were contributing factors to World War II.
Yeah. So while World War II may have started officially in 1939, trouble began to brew right after World War I, when Germany was punished for its part in World War I. Now, what was Germany punished with?
Well, you have to understand several things took place. First of all, going back a little earlier, before World War I, you have two rival sets of powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary on one hand, Russia, France, Great Britain on the other. And a lot of things were happening, particularly after the turn of the previous century. Nationalism, militarism, dictators, things of that nature that were happening. And there was alliances and alignments, and you had the decline of the Ottoman Empire. And there was a lot of conflict and turmoil going on in those years, say, roughly from 1900 on up. So there was kind of a powder keg there that was in place in Europe. Basically, scholars tend to focus on the summer of 1914. The immediate cause were decisions made by statesmen and generals during the crisis of July 14. And what triggered it, and most people have heard of this, was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. And he was assassinated by the Bosnian Serb nationalist, I can't pronounce his name, but anyway, he had been supported by a nationalist organization in Serbia. So the crisis then escalated as the conflict between Austria and Hungary and Serbia came to involve Russia, Germany, France, and eventually Belgium and Great Britain and so forth. Other factors that came into play during the diplomatic crisis that preceded the war included misperceptions of intent. In other words, a lot of people thought Germany thought Britain would remain neutral. So the war went on, and as you know, it was trench warfare. It moved very slowly. Eventually, of course, we got involved in April of 1917.
And then after the war, wasn't Germany much bigger before the end of the First World War?
They did slice away some of their territory, and also some of it went to Poland, and then some of what had been Polish territory went to Russia. So there was some realignments, and of course the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was dismantled, and you had with the Balkan states and Czechoslovakia and things like that. Yes, the map of Europe did change to a great extent, to some extent after World War One. One of the things that happened, of course, was that after the Americans came over, the American Expeditionary Force went over and really then tipped the power in favor of Great Britain and France and so forth.
In the First World War.
In the First World War, it was awful war. I mean, no war is good, but General John Pershing, who happens to be from Brookfield, Missouri, was the leader of the Expeditionary Force, and the bottom line was that eventually the Allies, that was us, were victorious. Now, here's where things got a little bit controversial. President Wilson had proposed a 14-point plan that would, he said, make the world safe for democracy. He was a little more idealistic than he should have been, but he certainly was on the right track.
He was well-meaning.
Yeah, and he actually went over there and was part of the peace negotiations and the process where the war was ended. But the main focus of his idea was the League of Nations, which would be similar to what we now know as the United Nations. And this was proposed, and Germany and France and others, England and France and so forth, they joined in the League. But the U.S. Senate, they did not feel that we needed to be in the League of Nations. And basically there was a push on the part of the American people to return to the days before World War I, when we were protected by both oceans. In other words, the isolationist policy. So, as a result, we sent observers to the League, but we were not a member. Now, whether had the League succeeded with American presence and American power, whether that would have prevented what later happened, we can't say. But it certainly might have.
Now, I have a question. In World War I, was Russia with the good guys or the bad guys?
Initially, they were with the good guys, and then they had so much turmoil in their own country that eventually they sort of just dropped out.
So they kind of became neutral.
Yeah, if you ever watch Dr. Zhivago, or Dr. Chicago, as I sometimes call it, they, you had the Soviet communists coming in and tremendous upheaval in the country, and in other words, civil war.
Yes.
And so they had their own problems, and of course, ultimately the Tsar was toppled over and things like that. So they kind of dropped out, but initially they were on the side of France and Great Britain and so forth.
But they were treated kind of like a pariah after the war, right? Because they kind of dropped out and did their own thing, and they weren't really well thought of.
Well, ultimately the communists took over. I mean, they became the powerful force in Russia and the Soviet Union, in other words, and the rise of Stalin and so forth and so on. Initially, the overthrowing of the Tsar was actually a movement kind of toward democracy, but that didn't work out, and ultimately this country did not recognize the Soviet Union until Franklin Roosevelt came in 1933. The main thing that happened after World War I, as far as what led to the World War II, was there was various factors. Obviously, the Depression was one of them, and tremendous inflation going on, and particularly in Germany, the reparations were so tough that that obviously led the way to the rise of Hitler and the Nazis and so forth.
Hitler himself. Now, part of the reason why this all happened, World War II, was Hitler was a soldier in World War I for Germany, and he had been a soldier. And there really, from what I understand, were no prospect nuts for him because the economy was in the toilet. They weren't going to be in another war. They were penalized heavily. So he decided to enter the world of politics.
Yeah, he did. A lot of it took place around Munich. He tried to overthrow the German government once, I think around 1923.
A coup.
Yeah, it was a coup, and he was arrested and put in jail, but treated very nicely in jail, and that's where he wrote Mein Kampf.
And what was Mein Kampf?
Well, I can't say that I've ever read it through, but it was his plan for Germany, and of course, a lot of what he did was to raise the fears of German people against those elements in society that he would have tried to convince them that they were part of the problem, namely the Jews. But he wasn't just against Jews; he was against homosexuals. He riled against people who had
People of color?
yes, people of color, people who had mental defects and things like that. He used pseudoscience to try to convince, and he did convince much of the German public that the Aryan nation, people who light skin, blonde hair, and so forth, was a superior race to any others.
So this Mein Kampf, we could call it his manifesto.
Right.
How did the Germans react to it?
Well, the Nazi Party bought into it, and ultimately, particularly as the Depression wore on, the Nazis got increasingly powerful. At first they were just considered sort of a wacko political party, but more and more they had, groups the brown shirts and people and a lot of the industrial leaders in Germany united with them, and ultimately they had enough votes in the Reichstag that was their parliament, to put Hitler into power in about 1932. Now, von Hindenburg, the old man who had been Germany's major general during World War I, was still the president. But ultimately...
he died.
Yeah, he died, and Hitler then became president as well as chancellor. Really, in effect, dissolved the Reichstag, including burning the building down.
Yeah, the actual burning of the German parliament, that was, some people found that a little suspicious, but it definitely was a good thing for Hitler.
Oh, yeah.
But before Hitler, while von Hindenburg was in office as president and Hitler was chairman, I want to talk about the political system there at that time, because it was technically a democracy, but they had, not like you and I today have in this country, basically two parties, and then you have the Green Party and a few other small ones that don't do very much, and you can run as an independent. Germany was a lot different from our democracy in that it had a lot of different political parties.
Yeah. And ultimately Hitler, really by dissolving the Reichstag, and it was becoming obvious even as in the early years, 1934-35, that he was a dictator, and this was not going to be a good thing. But at first, people liked what he did because he did bring about some prosperity.
Because they were affected by the New York stock market crash, correct?
Yeah, and in fact, in many cases, the Depression in Europe even started before the one in the United States did. And then, of course, they had our government, had they had some mercy to excuse some of the reparations, maybe some of this wouldn't have happened, but they did not. And as a result, Germany was terribly straddled by having to pay out all this money, war reparations. And of course, Hitler took advantage of that.
And he literally said, "We're going to make Germany great again." And that is what he tried to do. I mean, that was his pitch. So September the 1st, 1939, marks the 80th anniversary of the start of World War II. And we are talking today about what led up to the breakout of World War II. I'm Rachel Steele with Local Voices. We'll be right back with Jim Steele here on 94.7 KPIP.